So we're back with our extra questions. Thanks for staying behind. We have a question from Jono. Have you got some strategies around improving completion rates? How can we best support on-job learners?
It's a really good question, and it goes to the heart of much of our findings. Just to recap, what we found is that about 4 or 5 in 10 of learners from the data are not completing. And we found that there were kind of inequities in terms of that. The completion rate on average for learners of European descent was about 48%. For Māori and Pacific, it was 36%, so there's a bit of a gap there. And then we looked at that and compared it to our international kind of comparators. So Germany has a completion rate of 75%, but we've talked about how that's not quite a model that we can easily replicate.
Ireland has the same.
Ireland's 65. There's a lot to learn from Ireland, and I agree. I think Ireland is the one to really, and they've also transformed.
They have sector.
Yeah, and so when we looked at those comparators, what did they do well? They invested in employer training, better financial support to the learners, and they had clearer accountability systems, which, is at the heart of our findings that were unrelated to completion, but they're reinforced in completion. So if we get those things right, it should really help completion. Particularly from a learner lens, that financial support structure, it sort of drives people away from completing. They get enough of a ticket to be able to be a labourer, competent labourer, and earn, above a training wage, and that, they make that decision in the moment because they have other responsibilities. That can be a factor, and we came across that. And also, obviously, the other thing that really impacts completion is that learning experience and that lottery about whether your employer is a good trainer.
And a good employer.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Alex, anything to add there?
Not really, no.
No?
No.
Great. Cool. We're going to move to the next question. I'm going to jump to the bottom one because I think we'll stick with the completion theme for the moment, if that's all right, team. Feedback from completing apprentices shows that their main priority isn't completion itself, but gaining specific skills and knowledge to build their capability. Once they've achieved this, they don't often view withdrawing as a failure. It's a very interesting point. This suggests that the current focus on completion may need reevaluating. Developing targeted learning bundles to meet immediate learner needs could be more valuable and worth researching further. And I know you had some ideas on this, Alex.
I do. Hard to stop me once I start. I think the traditional framework that we've used in New Zealand, and we were quite instrumental in being a leader in that space in terms of the NZQA framework, has a role to play, but I don't know if its role is future-proofed enough. Right. So what I mean by that is that we now have different generation of a workforce that wants to engage differently with learning. And then we came up with the micro-credential idea. Ultimately, it still uses the NZQA framework, skills standard, unit standard, whatever you call it, as a way to measure.
And it isn't well-funded.
Not well-funded. There's still the compliance requirements, so it's still quite clunky. What we're talking about is alternative pathways to competency that may or may not use the NZQA framework as a basis for that. The learner and the employer both can agree when a skill has been developed and can be commercially, competent in the workplace. Now, that's going to add real value to the employer, to the employer's business, and to the apprentice.
Yep.
And I think when you think about the pace of change in our industry and the technology change, that's what we're seeing. We're seeing people engage with suppliers and wholesalers who can train them on product that's coming down the pipeline because they're not getting that from the current system we've got. And arguably you might say, well, that's the role of the employer to pay for that because it's benefiting their business. But I think we need to look at our apprenticeship system and say, how do we bring more of that into it? Because that's what's going to get more employers engaged or re-engaged in training. And we've got to think about capability development and competency development in quite a different way to education.
Achieving a skill standard or a unit standard.
Achieving in the traditional form of an education pathway.
Yeah, really interesting view. Thanks, Alex.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and I might take a kind of a counter view. Part of the work I do, unrelated to this work we did for ConCove, is around exploited workers. And it is quite tricky to design a system that enables flexibility for an employer to initiate with exploitative practice.
Yeah.
And so, and that's kind of in an employment kind of dynamic. But when it comes to the formal recognition of qualifications, which is kind of what we all want learners to have because it really steps them up into higher income potential and creates that career path trajectory. You know, it's tricky. So I'd say, well, what's the answer? Obviously, a skill system that's really responsive to the industry, which I think is your substantive point.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't say that the mechanics of how to achieve that are quite tricky when it comes to interacting with a system that needs to kind of regulate the qualification because most employers are good, but there's a lot of employers that also aren't.
Totally.
So, yeah.
Totally.
Great. Thanks both. Okay. We're going to talk about tax incentives or levies now, I think. We've had a question. A tax incentive for employers who provide formal training would be more effective. It may also encourage the many employers who currently don't offer formal training to participate, similar to how ACC's incentives successfully motivated businesses to improve workplace health and safety. So could this approach be explored further? Any thoughts?
Look, I mean, I think we would be a really big advocate for that. I think in the past, levies haven't been as easy to access and implement across the vocational system. I think the consultation that we're going through at the moment opens that up to conversation. And from our industry's perspective, we'd certainly be open to having that conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One caveat to that is that it appears from the consultation documents and that have been released to date is that it's very focused on a funding model or an exchange of funds for a thing, for a program or some learning materials, for example, or assessment or moderation. What the challenge with that is that it's just a simple exchange and it doesn't look at the bigger picture and how those funds could then be better invested back into the sector. So I think that's a little question mark that we have from Concove's perspective. We've also got a discussion paper coming out on funding this month too. So stay tuned for that because we will be looking for a lot of input from industry and the wider sector on that. And sorry, Sarah, over to you. Any thoughts on
I
on
mean,
levies?
I have to be honest with you both. I'm a recovering, economist and former Treasury official. So I have a pathological aversion to, tax incentives, which probably, we didn't really extensively cover this in our work. So I need to step through my aversion and actually I think that the work you've got coming out will be really relevant, especially if it is a form, we look at the Apprenticeship Boost and we think actually maybe it's run its course. Now how do we kind of incentivise attachment, to an employer, a good employer? So I think, though, it needs to be really informed by looking at what we want to achieve, the scale of funding that's currently being invested, where we're getting the best return, and who's delivering, what part of the learning experience the best. So I think I coped quite well in responding to that. So we didn't cover it extensively, though. It's super interesting.
Oh, thanks, Sarah. As mentioned, new question. As mentioned, Pacific and Māori learner completion rates are quite low. Are there any recommendations or suggestions on what support or pastoral support for Māori and Pacific Islanders could support them to increase completion rates?
Yeah, I mean, it's an excellent question. And as I said, the kind of completion rates are about 36%. There's good evidence in different programs that have been evaluated about what works. And we know what works is a positive experience of a Māori or Pacific learner being in a Māori or Pacific employment relationship. And also someone who, an employer who, if they're not Māori and Pacific themselves, are really empathetic toward different forms of learning and different cultural ways of, for example, the relationship and power distance with authority. So we've seen that in other work we've done. That's something that can be done well, and there have been particular schemes like the Māori and Pacific Trades Training, for example, that's been, really good learning out of how to deliver that. I did some work years ago now, about 10 years ago, in this area around labour market matching in South Auckland, where we had a high demand for workers and really challenging figures around NEETs, those not in education or training or employment. And that work, at the time it was quite radical. It was called the attitude gap, and we used co-design to really explore this feedback we were getting from employers around the attitude of these young people. And because we got below the surface of things using kind of deep qualitative research methods, we were able to talk about some of the stuff that is quite challenging to talk about, like institutional racism, barriers and presumptions, generational expectations being different. And, that's some of the stuff that is well evidenced and really challenging in terms of how to incentivise that. You kind of need to support employers to the points that you've been making, Alex, to understand the value of investment. Other bits of work we've done is that we sadly do see some evidence in work we've done before of immigration or migrant worker bias, and that is that migrant workers tend to come into our country incredibly valued, super critical for productivity in the sector, really important. They often come in with qualifications that aren't recognised, and they might go into different forms of work and they're overqualified already, theoretically, and they also have a very strong motivation to be successful in work. And some employers have found that a preference for migrant workers and provide them a lot of pastoral care and wraparound support.
Yeah, that's right.
And so if you took that effort and understood the value of that, of extending that to a young person who might be coming from a different setting than you are, then we'd probably see some improvement as well. So hard issue, complicated. We've got some success, certainly worth the effort, especially when you look at our demographic patterns. The most in 20 years' time, most of Auckland is going to be very different from the three of us.
That's right.
And it's really important that we get it right.
Alex, I know you had a thought on this too.
I was just thinking, again, it comes down to recruitment and fit. And, ultimately when you're recruiting for fit, you're recruiting for values alignment, and I think Māori Pacifica or other, if there's a values alignment there and there's really good clarity and expectations from an employer and an employee, let's call them, then I think you're setting each other up for success. So, notwithstanding your points, I think it comes down to having really good recruitment processes in place, and that includes induction and having really good induction and clarification on roles and expectations. Yeah.
Thanks for that. Okay, so we've got two more questions. For employers who see the importance of their role in ongoing learning, what policy settings would you recommend to be changed to support those employers? That was from Wayne. Any thoughts?
I think we've sort of touched on it. I mean, I think the whole acknowledgement that employers play a formal role in the vocational system, and we need to think about the fact that it's costing them time and money. They're building the productivity habits. They're building, 70, 80, 90% of that technical capability of that learner on the job. Yeah. So we need to recognise that. And yes, some may have some way to go to actually be the best trainer they can be, but we've probably got a lot that are operating right now. So we need to make sure that they're feeling empowered to keep doing what they're doing, recognise the fact that actually it's costing them some money. And actually probably reward them in a way that we probably haven't done before. Yeah.
Yeah. Great.
Yeah, in terms of policy settings, like when I think about policy settings, I'm thinking about the rules, the funding, the incentives. So funding, incentivising or creating rules around capability. And that doesn't need to be a stick, it can be a carrot or it can be a combination. And that came through really quickly from the research. The financial incentives kind of have mixed, results in terms of looking at it. And we've talked about a little bit about the kind of the importance, but also the limitations of the Apprenticeship Boost mechanism. And then there's just the capability, we've talked about that as well, around how most people want to do the right thing and they're not always equipped to do the right thing. And also when it comes to a sector that's really prone to boom and bust, they're not always got the time.
Yeah.
And they've got that kind of productivity training squeeze where they're kind of trading off when to invest and when to produce.
And I think when you're talking about capability development, what we're talking about is creating really good managers and leaders in businesses.
That's exactly what we're talking about.
And I think, if we took that lens to the role that the employer plays, we would probably get quite a bit of amplification of productivity just by investing in the employer and building them.
And it would also help the apprentice
Yep.
to understand what it would be like to actually be a successful employer in the future.
Right.
And it would have the a double dividend, as we say in the trade.
Yeah, double dividend. I love that.
Concove's got another piece of work coming out this year on pathways to successful SMEs, which effectively is looking at the German model and how that might be replicated here in New Zealand, and if indeed it was possible, which would provide a pathway for an apprentice to see that there is a next step, and in that next step learn some really important business skills, learn about the environment and the challenges that are in that space too, get some digital upskilling potentially, and also get that higher level technical skill as well. So four key things that you need when you're moving into business ownership and training the next generation. Yeah. Okay. Our last question for the day: how responsive is industry to apprenticeships in schools that allows senior secondary school students to undertake an apprenticeship while still at school? That one's for you, Alex.
We would be 100% supportive of that. If we can pick them up when they're passionate and interested and, with eyes wide open around what are the possibilities, if we could pick them up then, we're going to retain them. Right now, we only retain 30% of all those entering our industry. 30% are still with us after 5 years. And I didn't believe that stat. And no, they reran the numbers, it's true. And apparently it's a really good stat. So for me, if we can take them earlier and we can showcase the opportunities, the pathways that sit within a wide industry, imagine the productivity there. Be phenomenal. Less NEETs, less disengagement, starting them early. They'll own that house on your street.
They certainly would.
At an earlier age. So 100% supportive of that.
Great. Thanks very much. And thanks again.